I'd like to start with a moment of reflection. So I don't think anybody in this room was not touched by the tragedy that occurred here in Boston. I grew up about an hour south of here and actually lived a block from here for 3 years, and Patriots Day was always very special to me. My dad would get us in the car, we'd go watch the Sox game. Sorry, any Yankees fans. And we would go watch the finish of the marathon. So I was especially touched by the tragedy that occurred here with the Boston Marathon bombings. And I think it's fitting for us to recognize all of the victims of that and to recognize all of the responders. And I'd like to start with a quote from the Dalai Lama. There's a saying in Tibetan, tragedy should be utilized as a source of strength. No matter what sort of difficulties, how painful experiences, if we lose our hope, that's our real disaster. And I think that's a fitting way for me to start to talk about beer, because as I sat here this morning, I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that we are very fortunate people, because we get to work day in and day out on something that, as Jim said, brings a lot of pleasure to people's lives and helps people to have hope in the face of tragedies like that. So with that, let's jump into the agenda. What I'd like to take you through over the course of the next 20 minutes or so is some thoughts on building a national portfolio. And I'm going to break that up into what I call the hard stuff and the soft stuff. Then I'll share with you some of our perspectives at CBA as we look forward, share with you some watchouts, both personal and on behalf of the company, and as I said, leave some time for questions after that. So let's start with these buckets, the hard stuff, the soft stuff. What is that? Well, I think there's 4 things that you really need to be mindful of if you're thinking about building a national portfolio. So it's got to start with a point of view. You really have to have a perspective on what you think is happening in the market. It takes a vision on how are you going to seize the opportunity based on your view of the market. It takes an understanding of what is it going to take for me to realize this vision. And it takes what I call a trueness to both your brands and your company's capability. And I hesitate to use the word authenticity because unfortunately it's so overused, but I'll keep coming back to trueness because I think in there, I think everybody can understand what we're looking for when we talk about that. On the soft stuff side, you need a strong belief, you need conviction, you need a thick skin, you need a passion, not just for your brands and your business, but for the network. And you need a healthy dose of patience balanced with a sense of urgency. So let's jump into the hard stuff. First off, I think it's important to take a step back and look at what are we experiencing? What are we in the midst of? If you take a look at this chart, it shows you the segment share of the US beer market back to 1993. Then, 20 years ago, 1 in 20 beers that consumers consumed was an import or a specialty. Less than 5% of the market. 1 in 20. Today, 2 decades later, that's 1 in 4. Nearly 25% of the US beer market now is either import or craft, depending on your definition. That's pretty remarkable in 2 decades of what's happening. That's an ingrained trend, that's not a fad. Secondly, I think it's important in your point of view to understand how do you look at consumers. We believe inherently in the importance of occasions, but not exclusively the occasion. It's that sweet spot. It's the intersection of 3 critical factors: the consumer, the occasion that consumer finds themselves in, and the mindset that they bring to that occasion. So this morning at 9 o'clock, Jim Cook, in an occasion of speaking to us, had the mindset of, I want to have a beer. I want to relax this morning. Andy Thomas, at 1:45 or 2 o'clock, same occasion, a little bit of a different mindset, might want to take the edge off. I'll enjoy a Redhook Audible. I come in from mowing the lawn. I'm hot. My occasion is looking for a little bit of refreshment. I might drink a Bud Light Lime. I'm the same person, but that intersection of occasion and mindset is critical to understand why that 5% of the market's gone to 25 and beyond, and it's foundational for how we build out our portfolio. The other interesting data I want to share with you, and I've talked to this before, we heard a lot about variety seeking from Liz when she was talking about some things from Nielsen. But if you take a look, it's not just beer. The chart on the left shows you, based on some information from Yankelovich, that today, legal drinking age consumers who consume any alcoholic beverage will tell you that 92% of the time, they shift between beer and wine and spirits. Gone are the days of brand loyalty the way we knew it. It's the intersection of the occasion, the consumer, and the mindset. And gone are the days where somebody was just a beer guy. They don't exist anymore. 92% drink beer, wine, and spirits regularly. And interestingly, on the right, what's happening to craft? It's not the beer geek anymore. And this is where I have so much hope in the future. If you decompose craft volume into 3 segments, the exclusive craft drinker, who consumes over 90% of their volume in craft, the person who consumes over half of their volume in craft, or the person who's just dabbling in craft and it's under 50% of their volume, they each account for an equal amount of craft volume. Fascinating. The beer geek, that holy grail for so many craft beer companies, is only 1/3 of craft beer volume, and that number is going down pretty fast. So, given our perspective, what's our vision? As Chris said, we are not collectors of brands. We fundamentally believe that the way to attack a national portfolio strategy is that different brands satisfy different occasions and mindsets in consumers. You attack that sweet spot differently. And very clearly, we are very fortunate that we have fantastic brands with a rich history that we can help to unleash to satisfy consumers in all those different occasions. So very simply for us, what's our vision? If you go to the far left, take a look at that import volume I talked about 14% of the market. We unapologetically go after that volume and that occasion and that drinker and that mindset that's typically import with Kona. Kona is a brand that appeals to the craft in somebody who's in that import occasion or who's an import drinker traditionally. You go to the far right, remember that 75% of that chart I showed you, that big blue band, that mainstream domestic drinker? That's who we go after with Redhook. Unapologetically. It's a crossover beer. It's a beer for a consumer who finds themselves in a mainstream occasion, but might be in a craft mindset and might not want to drink what they're used to drinking all the time. In the middle, we position clearly Widmer Brothers, one of the pioneers in the craft beer space, to really go after that craft occasion and to go after that craft mindset and that craft consumer. And then most recently, along the bottom, our offering for gluten-sensitive consumers, Omission, bringing real craft beer flavor, beer brewed with real beer ingredients, malted barley, but then crafted to remove gluten. So the key for us, in our vision, is the brands don't sit on top of each other. They all have a purpose. They all have a reason for being, and that's complementary, and that's not duplicative. So what does it take? So that's about the portfolio, but if you're going to be national, I think it's important to understand that national means national. Okay? In the same way that Jim talked this morning about, virgin means virgin, national means national. So recently, Buffalo Wild Wings announced in their earnings call a collaboration we're doing with them on Redhook for a beer called Game Changer. What attracted Buffalo Wild Wings to us and us to Buffalo Wild Wings for Game Changer was 2 things. One, we were real. We were going after the consumer who frequents their establishments and who they know a lot about and who they want to be able to program more towards. And secondly, they have over 900 locations on that map. So it was important to them that they found somebody who could not only bring them a legitimate brand with legitimate understanding of their consumer, but who could also service them nationally. So national means national. So it takes national reach. And make no bones about it, for us, our affiliation with Anheuser-Busch seamlessly across the US is a huge advantage for us. And for any of you who are looking to expand, I think you understand footprint problems can be an Achilles heel for a small brand. I lived it with a brand that wasn't so small called Heineken. Footprint problems are something to look out for as you grow, and I think it's why as you see brands enter states, increasingly they're going either red or they're going blue-silver. Secondly, supply chain is key. It's critical to make sure that as we have a national approach, we can actually supply those locations, and we can do it in a way that provides fresh beer and in a way that's true to who we are. The other thing that's really important is talent. I would argue that the right people are critical to this. It is not about the brands. And we've all heard the expression, youth is wasted on the young. I would submit to you that talent is often wasted on big companies. Because where you really need somebody who's scrappy and has the right acumen and who has the experience is in all of our collective businesses where the margin for error is this big. Somebody once asked me, what's it like to work for a small company like CBA after working for a big company like Heineken? And I said it is way tougher because there's no margin for error. If we dump beer, that's going to hit our bottom line in a way that's much more painful than it will for a big company. And lastly, resources are critical because national chains might admire sometimes small, quirky brands, but I assure you they do not admire and they do not tolerate small-minded and quirky service levels. If you're going to play with the big boys, you've got to be able to play with them. And that's critical as we start to look at what it takes to build a national portfolio. Lastly, trueness. I say real is like pornography. You know it when you see it. Consumers can smell a fake. They know what's not real. If you look up on the top left, consumers walked away from Redhook because Redhook walked away from Redhook. Redhook went from that bottle on the left, which said to consumers, I'm small, I'm quirky, I'm real, I'm authentic, to that long neck bottle with a split label design and this wonderful embossing on it that felt as phony on it as could be, and consumers knew that. And it wasn't until we got Redhook back to being what Redhook was all about, in dress that it was comfortable with a voice and with beers that it was comfortable with, did we start to see Redhook grow. 2 years of consecutive growth on Redhook after 5 years of decline. If you take a look, continuing to the right, Widmer Brothers, the launch of Alchemy Ale, the coming launch of a collaboration with our friends at Cigar City down in Tampa for a beer called Gentleman's Club. Doing things that defy convention the way that the Widmer Brothers defied convention in 1984 when they started brewing. Getting back to being true. And lastly, Kona, on the far right. Not resting on its laurels and saying, we bring liquid aloha to everybody wherever we go. There's a sense of place about the Kona brand. And one of the things we do to continue to make sure that we fuel that is by making sure that doing things like the new Kona custom bottle help transport the consumer who picks up a Kona to a beach in Hawaii. So it's important that as you understand what's happening with your point of view and you have a vision and your understanding of what's happening, that it's done in a way that is true and authentic to your brands. So what about the soft stuff? Well, I'd offer that it takes a strong belief and conviction. Remember, if you're taking the road less traveled, that means few others have taken it. You're not going to be able to look to a lot of folks for advice because they haven't done it, or they haven't had the testicular fortitude to try to do what you're trying to do. And that's important to remember. It takes a passion for the network. I would submit to all of you that it's about time that Craft kind of put its big boy pants on with respect to wholesaler relations a lot too. It's not enough to just call wholesalers our partners. We need to treat wholesalers like our partners. And that's something that requires a different set of skills than a lot of folks have had in the craft industry. It takes a thick skin. And I say here, learn to cherish the haters. I find myself biting my tongue a lot. And maybe that's because of what I would characterize as the lunacy of trade organizations trying to tell consumers what's really craft versus what's crafty. Think about that. We were trying to tell consumers what they should drink and what they shouldn't because of our squabbles amongst ourselves. That takes a thick skin. Being called Budhook takes a thick skin. Being called big by somebody who's walking around with an iPhone and wearing a pair of Nikes takes a little bit of a thick skin because you have to remember that they're the consumer. And lastly, on the soft stuff, it takes patience. Rome was not built in a day. And one thing we find, and I'm sure all of you find, as you build out your portfolio, consumers might have a shorter memory than retailers and wholesalers do. Because one of our biggest challenges on the soft stuff is reminding people that this is not the Redhook of 3 years ago, but that's what they remembered. And you've got to be patient, and you've got to be respectful along the way. So as we move forward, what's the crystal ball saying? Well, I'll tell you, I am not a big proponent, and CBA does not believe this is a fad. This is interesting. This is a chart that Chris Thorne sent around from the Beer Institute. And everybody quotes it and says, oh my God, look at all the breweries in the US. We have the largest number of breweries ever. How can we sustain this? I'd offer a different point of view. I would tell you that Prohibition was a reset for the US beer market, for the US alcoholic beverage market. And in fact, the US beer market is only 80 years old. It's an infant. We're just getting back to where we were in 1887. Doesn't sound like we're getting out of control to me. And we also have to remember that from a consumer perspective, the beer category isn't unique from the trends in other categories, and Liz alluded to this. But it's really important for us to remember as we talk about the fact that this might be a fad or how is this going to grow, the same trends that compel a consumer to pick up a craft beer are the trends that compel them to start going to Starbucks. Or they're the trends that started compelling a millennial to not buy a CD anymore because they'd rather pick and choose what songs they want to download and put on their iPod. Those are fundamental shifts in consumer behavior that I would suggest are going to continue. And I tell you, I think there's a ton of run room. This chart shows the beer market by state, total beer market. Look at the big five over there on the left-hand side of that chart. California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, and the list goes on. Craft beer nationally is about 1 out of 12 beers sold. In the largest beer state, California, it's 1 out of 9. But take a look at where it is at number 2. In Texas, 1 out of 33 beers is craft. In Florida, 1 out of 19 beers is craft. How big can it get? Oregon and Washington? Who knows? 1 out of 5 is craft. So I would suggest to you that this isn't a fad. There are a lot of brewers over there, but the industry is young, and there's a lot of run room in places where I think we would all like to have a little bit more business. So the ever-present threat of a bubble, who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. But as I look out, I say what bubble and where. If you take a look at this chart also provided by our friends at the Beer Institute, difficult to see, but it shows the number of breweries by state. Because we look at the averages. We look at that 2,751 and that increase of 400. But look at where they are. California, 363 breweries, 31 new brewing permits last year. But take a look down at Florida, 68. Up only 16. Look at Texas, 90. Second largest beer state in the country, 90 breweries, up 29. You know, I think it's important for us to remember, and again, look outside the category. The dot-com bubble was not caused because the internet was a fad. The dot-com bubble existed because bad decisions were made, there was a lack of talent, and a lack of experience. I would submit to you those are lessons we should learn as we basically are stewards of what this craft beer boom is all about. So as I close, let's look at watch-outs. I think we need to beware of groupthink and the talking heads, present party included. We are really good at, as a colleague of mine once said, smelling our own perfume. We get up every day and we are fortunate enough to love this business and work in it every day, but we sometimes get the blinders on as a result. Secondly, remember national averages are misleading. My head's in the oven, my feet are in the freezer, and on average I'm at 98.6. I don't think I'm going to have a really good prognosis though. National averages are misleading. Remember, conventional wisdom is just that. It's conventional. When I was with Heineken in the 90s, nobody would have ever predicted that Corona would become Corona. It was the blue jeans import. It was all about Beck's and all about Heineken. Conventional wisdom was wrong. Conventional wisdom would not have predicted that craft would be where it is today, nor would it predict that cider is booming the way it is. Additionally, I would suggest that a watch-out is we need to resist labels. Craft. Number of times somebody asked me if Shock Top is craft. Is Blue Moon craft? Craft is in the eye of the beholder. So I would submit to you that for somebody who's used to drinking a Bud Light, a Blue Moon or a Shock Top is a pretty crafty beer. But what do? We try to squabble over that. And in the process, we separate ourselves from each other because the BA can't get along with the BI, can't get along with the NBWA, and any other acronym you want to throw in there. But more importantly, it separates us from consumers because the last thing any of us want to do is basically tell our consumers what to think. Our consumers have an expectation now. We heard it from Simon's presentation, and we need to honor that. And lastly, as I close, I think it's important to remember who the enemy is. We're competitors, we're not enemies. The enemy is irrelevance. And if we keep our blinders on and we forget that we interact with wines and spirits, and if we look down our nose at the person who's drinking a beer somewhere because we don't think that that place is worthy of our product sometimes, I think we start to become irrelevant in their eyes, which is probably the biggest risk we have. So in closing, what does it take to build a national portfolio? It takes the hard stuff. You got to have a point of view, you need a vision, you need an understanding, and you need to be true to your brands and to your company. And on the soft side, we all need to have a strong belief in that conviction. We need to have a pretty thick skin. We need to love the people around us, be they wholesalers or retailers, our employees, our brands, and be passionate about it. And lastly, we need to have that healthy dose of patience balanced with urgency. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and we'll take any questions anybody might have.